Hello and welcome to session 3 of our pyramid model training series. Today we are going to be focusing on the physical environment. I'm thinking about the classroom environment and what are the messages I will get from the environment. So session 2, we talked about expectations and rules. We talked about ways in which you can set program-wide expectations as a team. Also thinking about connecting those expectations to your classroom rules and rules for other settings within the program. We also talked about how you might share this information with families and help families think about rules at home, rules at the grocery store, rules other places within the community, and supporting their children and meeting those expectations. So I would just like you to take a little bit of time to reflect in terms of how did you use any of that information, what went well, what might have been challenging, and what might you adjust. As we are doing this training series, while you are not in the classroom, you might also be thinking about how you might use this information when we return in the fall. Okay, so the expectations or the objectives for this session are really to think about how the physical environment supports relationships, supports clear expectations, child engagement, emotional literacy, and positive peer interaction. Again, we always want to turn back to the early learning standards and thinking about the domain of social emotional development, and really thinking about how we support children and engaging in positive interactions with others, in being persistent, in taking risks, all of those pieces, and being resilient through how we set up a physical environment. And I think a lot of times we don't realize all of the messages that we give through the environment. So again, we are going to review our pyramid. Right, so everything is based upon the effective workforce. That means that you need to take care of yourself before you can take care of others, and really making sure that your needs are being met. Also really thinking about how to create a workplace that is healthy, that you're supporting one another, that you're supported by the administration and leadership, and all of those pieces. We then move into the first tier, which is really developmentally appropriate practice and what we do for all children. And in this, we talk about the importance of relationships. We talk about the importance of the physical environment. We also talk about the importance of schedules, routines, and clear expectations. We've talked about a lot of those things in the first 2 sessions, and this time with the third session, we're going to move into the role of the environment. Now, again, I want you to look at the indicators of practice handout. So if we go into our Google Classroom here, we have our IOP for environments. So making sure that you're taking the time to look through this inventory of practices and what are things that you're doing to support high quality relationships, set clear expectations, support child engagement, support emotional literacy, and positive peer interactions, which you'll notice connects directly back to the outcomes for this learning session or for this session. What are things that you're currently doing that you have been doing through the use of the environment to support these goals, right? And so you are rating yourself in terms of, is this something I do consistently, occasionally, not yet? What are some examples of how you already do this, as well as some strategies or ways that you might want to practice, right? Both in terms of You might want to think about how you're going to share some of this information with families, and how they can really promote the home environment to support children's engagement and learning, to support that parent-child relationship. And also, what are things that you're going to try in the fall in setting up your classroom for the next school year? Also, if you scroll back up to the next page, this is the page where you really think about these practices, think about the children that you're supporting, set one goal for yourself, and then break it down into actionable steps. Okay. So during our time with this session, we're going to talk about all of this through the lens of the pyramid model. We're going to talk about what are the messages that are conveyed by the environment and identify strategies to communicate these messages. So this is an activity, and since we are doing this virtually, it's something for you to think about to yourself, particularly now as we probably think every store is wonderful because we would like to go anywhere. But back when it was a daily choice that you could go to the store, think about a store that you hate to shop in, right? For me, I really do not like Walmart. And what I don't like about Walmart is that the aisles are very narrow. There's lots of people. The lighting is very industrial, so it just feels uncomfortable. I get really overstimulated because of the fluorescent lighting, the closed in spaces, the people, the noise. It's a space that makes me very physically uncomfortable because it's overstimulating. I also have a hard time finding things. One Walmart seems to be set up differently than another. So I would prefer, I mean, I don't like shopping in general because I get overstimulated pretty easily. But I would prefer Target because in general, the aisles are wider. Most stores seem to follow the same map, so you tend to be able to find things in different stores. The lighting is more muted. I find going there less overstimulating. So as we think about this, we want to think about that emotional reaction, the physical reaction that you have to an environment, right? And when we think about young children, when we think about families, the way that they are differs in different environments, right? So we really want to think about how are we using our environment? How are we thinking about the environment of the entire program as well as within our classrooms to welcome families, to welcome children, and to make them feel like this is a safe and positive place to be. So here we have our cranky lady again, who's kind of pushing back a little bit and saying, well, this is my space. This is my classroom. I like things set up in a certain way. I know where things are. I'm the adult. I get to set things up the way that I like them. But we know that environment impacts behavior. This might also be a response that you get from families in terms of talking about the home environment and how the home environment is set up to support the child. And the family may feel like, well, this is my space. I'm the adult. Why should I have to do this? But really understanding that children need space of their own. Children need to have access to materials that are interesting and engaging, or you are going to see challenging behavior. And we know that within 75 seconds of walking into your program, children and families decide if this is a good place or not, right? So those first impressions are so important and they happen so quickly, and it's really hard to overcome negative first impressions. So really thinking about how your environment is set up, and not just your classroom itself, which is what you have the most control over, but also how families are greeted upon entering the building, how they're supported in finding the classroom that they're trying to get to, all of those pieces. And when they walk into your classroom, are you greeting them? Are you greeting them by name? Are you greeting the child? Are you asking questions and engaging in a conversation? Um, every year at the beginning of the year, we do the Early Childhood Environmental Rating Scales observation. And one of the things that that tool looks at is greeting and departures, right? And with greetings, the expectation is that you are greeting the family and the child by name, and that you are engaging in a conversation, asking the family about the child, asking how their night was, how their morning was, asking for health information. And that's a really important part of how you welcome that child into the classroom. You also might want to think about, because for many of you, the children, most of the children, if not all of the children, are arriving before you do, because they're coming for before care, before the formal pre-K day starts, right? And so how do you manage that transition? How do you support the before and after care teachers and building relationships with the families and having those conversations at drop off? And how do you then support the sharing of information, so whatever information was shared by the parent with that teacher is then shared with you? The same as with pickup. If that child is being picked up after you have left for the day, after the preschool day has ended, how are you sharing information in terms of what happened during the day? So as we think about room arrangement, we really want to think about how do we create a space that is inviting, but also how do we create a space that is functional so that children know what to do, right? Because when children know what to do, that's where you see less challenging behaviors and you see that children are engaged and learning. So as we think about the messages that the environment gives, we're going to go through a number of those messages. And so this next series of slides is really going to focus on relationships and the messages of this is a good place to be and you belong here. Again, this is a handout that is in your Google Classroom. So if we click on the powerful messages, and this is something that was developed by Creative Curriculum back in the day when it was one book rather than multiple boxes. But you can see that there's a number of different messages that the environment gives, right? And so we are starting with this is a good place to be and you belong here. And you can also see with this handout that under each of these messages, there's a number of bulleted strategies that you can use to give these positive messages. So as we think of this as a safe and inviting space, having different textures of materials, having things that are alive, so we can see there are the plants, there's the different seats, so there's the small sofa, there's the chair that has a soft fabric, there are the stuffed animals and puppets, there's the basket that is a different kind of texture. We want to make sure that not everything in the classroom is plastic, right? That we have different textures, that we have softness. You can see that there's display on the wall at the child's level, right? These are all things that we look at with the Early Childhood Environmental Rating Scales, or ECERS tool. Having a quiet space. So this is an example for toddlers, right? So a book area where the books are displayed are easy to access. Sometimes we can also use baskets and things like that. Having the book corner be a space that's protected from other traffic, having it really be a cozy area. You can see we also have pictures of children and their families in this area. And while we're thinking about this as a toddler area, because the furniture is smaller and closer to the ground, even with preschoolers, we want to have this kind of a space. And remembering that, especially for those of you who are working with the threes, some of them may be closer to toddler when they start with you at the beginning of the year. You might also think about, in terms of as we're supporting families and being at home, how are they creating a quiet space where their child can go, right? And especially as we're thinking about some of those families who have a large number of people, maybe extended families, in a very small space. How do you create those little spaces for the child to have some quiet? Displaying children's work is also a great way to build relationships and to give the message that you belong here, that this is a good place to be. And I think this is just a really cute strategy of where they've got a clothing line with clothespins to hang art to dry. But they've put the children's pictures on the clothespins, which again really gives that message of you belong here. This is your space. This is your work. Having three-dimensional art. Again, this is something that the ECERS tool looks at. So having that three-dimensional art displayed, having the child's name clearly labeled. You can also think about this in terms of how do you save children's work that they're not done with, so that if a child is working on a sculpture or something like this and isn't done, but it's time to move on to the next routine of the day, do you have a system? Do you have a place to store it so that they can return to it later? If children are involved in complex building with blocks or something else, is there a way to save that, or maybe just take a picture of what they built and display that to be respectful of the work that they've done? Having space for children to store their personal belongings and having that space within the classroom so that they can access it easily also gives that message of this is a good place to be and you belong here. Again, we can make that parallel to the home environment. And does the child have space of their own, space for their own toys and clothing and belongings? A documentation panel can be a good way of illustrating what children do during the day. It's also a great learning strategy to reinforce the learning objectives from that lesson. So this is an example of an activity around seeds. It's a way to extend that learning. Maybe you could have this demonstration or documentation panel on the wall, and underneath it a shelf with seeds from that activity, with maybe some toy fruit and vegetables that children can play with and extend their learning. But it also, for somebody entering the classroom, it's showing these are the kinds of fun and engaging things that happen throughout the day. We also want to think about having adult-sized furniture and places for adults to be able to sit comfortably with the children. that it's really hard for us as adults to comfort a child, to interact with a child if there's not a space for us that is the appropriate size. And a lot of times it's more the width of the seat than the height, right? Because sitting on preschool chairs can be challenging. And sitting on the floor, while that is typically what happens throughout the day pretty often, having adult-sized furniture to sit on and spend time with the children is also important. We also want to make sure that within the program there is space for you. There is space for you to relax and get away, whether it's space to get work done or space to take a break during the day, during your lunchtime, or during planning time at the end of the day. So these are just some examples of programs that really made an effort to have spaces and for the adults and to have decorations and other things that really create that relaxed tone and environment. I've also, when I've been doing class observations, I've been in schools where there are positive messages posted on the wall in the bathroom and things like that as really an effort to care for the mental well-being of the teachers and to have those messages of what they are doing every day with children is important. Here's another great example of some staff positive feedback. We've been talking about how important it is to give children positive and descriptive feedback. This is an example of giving staff that feedback, right? We need to fill our piggy bank or fill our gas tanks. So this is again from a early childhood program. Each car has a staff member's name on it. The strips of paper are used to write a positive message for that staff person, and you can see some of the cars here. You can see the messages that are slipped behind the car and the board. Having children's pictures and having pictures of children's families displayed in the classroom also gives that message of you belong here. This is a good place to be. I think this is a really creative idea within the dramatic play area to have this set up as you would see a table in a living room with children's pictures and family pictures displayed in frames. Okay, so then our next section is the environment promotes clear expectations. So how do we give the message of this is a place you can trust and there are many things you can do on your own and be independent, right? Because part of what we really want is to be thinking about how does the environment support children in knowing what to do? How does the environment support children in being independent and making choices about what they want to do and how they want to play with materials? And when children are able to move around the environment independently and they're engaged, that then allows you to be interacting with children individually or in small groups, which allows you to use a lot of those teaching practices that we've been talking about in terms of asking children how and why questions and really pausing and having the child respond, engaging in those back and forth interactions of where you're supporting a child in getting to the correct answer or completing a task. You have to be able to provide that focused attention and really engage with a child for a period of time to use those teaching strategies that really support learning. If you're managing challenging behaviors, if you're interacting with children as a whole group for most of the day, you're not able to do that, right? So in our last session, we talked about posting expectations and rules. and really having that be clearly shown throughout the environment and taking opportunities to talk about those expectations and rules throughout the day. Again, this is another piece that comes up in the ECHRS is, are you talking about the display? So when you have things like classroom rules and expectations posted and then you're referring to them, that also meets the expectations of the ECHRS tool. Thinking about how you have your classroom clearly defined and the floor plan. So again, this is something that comes from Creative Curriculum. And so we have our different interest centers. Again, this is a little bit outdated. Now we're talking about technology instead of computer. And again, I know we've been talking about really what is the role of technology and the role of the computer in the classroom, and really thinking about how we use that in meaningful ways, or is that meaningful in a preschool classroom, because we know that children are spending lots of time in front of screens. But being really thoughtful about how you set up your environment, how you create those different interest centers, how you separate messy and quiet play and active play, and protect the quiet play. All of those pieces that you have to think about as you're setting up your environment, making sure that you have the required interest centers for creative curriculum, but also really thinking strategically in terms of the size of your space, right? So as we think about room arrangement and design and thinking about those learning centers, we want to make sure that they're engaging. We want to make sure that the materials are relevant to child's lives and interests, that we're bringing in materials that are culturally responsive and representing children's experiences at home. And that there's a wide variety of materials, and that we're changing and rotating those materials and really connecting your lesson planning and your goals and objectives that you're setting for the children, that those opportunities for learning should be embedded in the interest centers. We want to make sure that we're setting up our different interest centers in ways that are organized so children know what to do, right? So as we look at these two different writing centers, we can see the one at the top is very disorganized, it's messy, it's cluttered, there are materials that don't belong there. If you look in the bin, there's some dolls in there. So you really want to make sure that the space that you have is well organized. Children know where things go. You also want to make sure that there's sufficient table space for the children to engage in literacy activities, to be doing writing and other things. I've seen writing centers where, it's a small table off to the side and there's so many materials that there's not really space for the children to use them. You also need to think about, as you're setting up your writing center, how many children can use it at once, and making sure that there's sufficient space for that, and that also you have the systems in place so that children know how many are allowed in an interest center at once. Having signs or cues for when an interest center is closed. Now you really want to be thoughtful about when you do this. You all know that my own bias is that I'm not all that crazy about computers in the classroom in the first place. So having that space closed is maybe something that you choose to do at different points of the day. But in terms of your other interest centers, you really want to make sure that for the most part, the space is open and available, particularly during free play. When I was a childcare director, I had some teachers where they created like little curtains, and they had a strip of Velcro at the top of a shelf, and they would cover the shelves with the fabric when those materials were not available. And while that was a good cue for the children to know when things were not available, we really have to be thoughtful about making sure that children have access to a variety of materials that support all of the domains of development throughout the day, right? And again, that's another thing that the Eckers looks at in terms of your daily schedule and when do children have access to different materials, whether it's fine motor materials or dramatic play, or math materials, etc. And really looking at, do they have access for a significant portion of the day? Making sure that your space is organized so that children know what to do. Again, this space is confusing. You've got dramatic play materials, gross motor materials, all in the same area. Whereas you can see this is a dramatic play area that's nicely organized and labeled, and it's clear what children are supposed to do in that space. We also want to make sure that materials are stored in a way that's easy for children to access. This is a fun infant toddler example of you're a little bit worried she's going to fall straight into the bin. But really thinking about how are we making sure that materials are easy to access, but they're also organized by type, right? So if you have a basket on the shelf and it's filled with a bunch of different stuff from different places, it's confusing, right? And so making sure that the shelves are labeled, the baskets are labeled as possible, and that the materials that are supposed to be in the basket are the things that are in the basket, and teaching children how to clean up and straighten up their area as they're moving between interest centers. Because we also see that challenging behaviors escalate as the room gets messier during free play. So you want to really have, it's that whole idea of through structure and through those clear expectations about how children use materials, how children move through the space, really does in the end allow for more independence and freedom. This is an infant example. I know that we're focused on older children, but I think this shows a creative use of materials, of taking a tall, high shelf and putting it on its side, and having small compartments for different kinds of toys. So you can think about equivalents of how you might do that with older children, and displaying materials for older children. Having environmental cues in terms of where to put things. I see this often with blocks. And if as an adult, I have a hard time figuring out how to put the blocks away, the 3 and 4-year-olds are going to have a hard time doing that. So you want to make sure that it's clear and simple. Right? And so here we have that example. And then we do have in your Google Classroom, there is the handout about labeling. I know that you guys are all really good about labeling everything. But again, really doing that extra step of reflecting, does it make sense? And are children able to use those labels and those visual cues to know where to put things away and how to clean up? Here is another example. Okay, so our next section is environments promote child engagement, giving the message of this is a place you can explore and try out your ideas, right? And so having those hands-on materials, again, that are organized in a logical way. So you have all of the block materials and the accessory for block play in the same space. you have enough open floor space for multiple children to be building, all of those kinds of things. And again, this is something that the Eckers tool looks specifically at and gives you some nice guidelines. Part of why I'm bringing up Eckers is, well, first of all, that we'll be doing it in the fall, so it's a good thing to be reminding yourself of. But the tool is really helpful as a kind of checklist to think about what are the different areas and what are different things that I can work on to improve the functionality of the environment. And again, as we think about the pyramid and really think about these are the pieces that we need to put in place at the beginning of the school year, that then allow you to be able to implement the teaching practices that are looked at through the class tool, which will then be evaluated as we move on with the school year and you've gotten that foundation in place. This is a great example of creating a space just for one. You want to have space in the classroom where children can be by themselves, where they can get away. And this is a program that took one of the old cribs. Remember, there was a time when we had to switch out all of our cribs for safety, new safety regulations. They turned the crib on its side and made it a little cubby for a child to be in and get away. This is a great example of bringing nature inside. What a calming and lovely space, right? Of having all of the branches and the tree stumps as seats to do music and movement, to do group activities, and just for children to spend time. Thinking about how you set up space to invite children in, to invite children to play with things in an expected way. I think this is a good example in terms of those carpets that you can get for cars and planes and things that a lot of times children aren't really quite sure what to do with them. And so setting the stage, so to speak, you can see here that the planes are placed on the carpet, really giving those cues. If you're wanting to do an activity with children where they're building with blocks and maybe making ramps, and things like that, maybe setting up the space to invite that kind of play and to invite that kind of exploration if you're thinking about speed, and how different things, how quickly, I saw in one classroom, the children were building ramps with the blocks and then they were using marbles and the different sizes of marbles. They were comparing how fast the different sizes of marbles went down the ramp, those kinds of things. Making sure that you have ample space and open floor space. Again, this is an infant example, but I think that there are comparisons for older children. A big challenge in infant classrooms is the sleep space, right? And the amount of space that cribs take up. I've been in infant classrooms where there really was very limited floor space for the children to play. But you can also think about within your classroom, what are those routine care areas? What are the spaces? And how do you open up spaces for multiple uses so that there's ample space and children can spread themselves across the entire room? Giving choice as a teaching strategy, right? Offering choices to children verbally through pictures, through objects, offering choices within activities of what children want to do, as well as between activities. Right, so this is an example just as you look at the materials, what kind of choices are available, right? So this child is playing with Play-Doh. There's a number of different kinds of tools that she can be using for the Play-Doh, but you can also see that there's a number of other items on the table that have been placed for her, giving her choices to draw with markers, to draw with crayons. We see in the background the easel is available, and all of the items on the shelf, that there really are a lot of options for that child to choose from as she's playing in the art area. We want to also make sure that we are bringing materials outside and really thinking about how we're extending play when children are outside. Outdoor play shouldn't just be an opportunity for children to run around and for you to take a break and have a conversation with your co-teacher. But really, how do we take those dramatic play materials, those fine motor materials, the gross motor materials, and bring them outside? Using visuals for choice in terms of identifying what choices the child can make with the different interest centers, right? And so how do you maybe use visuals to support children in choosing their interest center and what they want to do? For some children who have a more difficult time with transitioning or have a more difficult time engaging, and you might see them kind of moving around the room and not really being engaged in any one activity. Sometimes having a mini schedule where the child can look at cards like these displayed and choose what they want to do can be helpful. Here is another example of a choice chart for songs. So offering children choices of what song they want to sing. And when we think about teaching practices and the class tool, regard for student perspective falls in here of giving choices and giving independence. I've also seen in the classroom having a square cardboard dice where there's different things on each side. So as you're throwing it, you're having the child throw the dice, and then whatever thing it lands on is the song that you're singing, or maybe the movement activity, or perhaps a breathing activity. We also want to think about how the environment promotes emotional literacy and gives the message of you can get away and be by yourself when you need to. Having feeling charts supports emotional literacy. So these are some examples. The one on the left, they printed out the feeling chart from the Pyramid Model website. On the right, they actually included pictures of children. So, and you can see that it's just slightly different how it's set up so there's the children put the picture, which is again the same picture from the Pyramid Model website, underneath their picture. On the left, you can see that with the clothespins, the clothespin has the child's name and picture, and the children are placing the clothespin on the emotion. We have our feeling dice, so you can have an activity where children talk about what their emotion is, where they maybe act out different emotions. Our feeling wheel, well, this is another resource that is available on the Pyramid Model website, so you can have one for every child where they're identifying what their feeling is at the moment. Or you can also have this in dramatic play or a different interest center for children to act out different emotions. This is also something that you can do as a large group activity or maybe even a small group activity. Having space for children to be by themselves. We had seen before the crib on its side, which is a creative use of materials. This is a space that was made using 2 crib mattresses that then are placed together to create kind of this little tent area. This is an example of a quiet space for infants. So again, thinking about that infant space, but as you look at this environment, you can see there's the soft lighting, the use of the fabric to kind of create a soft space. There are the plants, there's the pillows, there's the rugs, all of these things that create softness and comfort. Again, a quiet spot for toddlers. Having space, having interest centers just for 1 or 2 children. So this is an example of a listening center. with just a space for 2 children. This picture is a little outdated because it's, well, actually, I guess the big headphones are coming back into style. But you can also see that there's some nice visual prompts here that really show that this is a space for 2 children and for quiet activity. We also want to think about environments that promote positive peer interactions. Mirrors can be very useful in the environment to support children interacting with one another, thinking about how we set up the space, how we set up materials to really support interactions, to support children playing together, to teach some of those friendship skills, which we'll be going into more deeply in a later session. Right. And so one of the resources that I've posted, again in your Google Classroom, is the cardboard additions for the sensory table. So I haven't set this up as an activity, but I really want you to think about, and we will talk about this more when we have our in-service in August, but what are ways that you can add materials to interest centers to really support children playing and working together? And so this is an example of where different materials were added to the sensory table to really extend play. I was in a classroom doing an observation where you were building a rocket ship. And the body of the rocket ship was in the art area, and children were working together to paint it. That's a good example of using materials to really support children and interacting and working together. I'm thinking about ways in which you organize how many children can be in an interest center, how children pick their centers. You all have really good systems in place with the pictures. Thinking, one thing I would say in terms of thinking about those systems, being thoughtful about the time that that takes, right? Because the whole purpose of having children have their picture and they pick which interest center they want to be, and each interest center has a sign with space for the number of children that are allowed, and they have to move their picture around so that they're able to move between centers independently, but you make sure that the rule around the number of children per center is being followed. All of that is good, and really, again, creating that structure and those rules and expectation that leads to independence and freedom. But sometimes I've been in classrooms where I see that time around the process of picking a center and the process of transitioning from one center to another, that the amount of time that takes actually then is taking away from children's engagement and learning, right? And so if the system is beginning to take up time, that you have to think about that, right? Because we want to minimize the number of transitions and we want to minimize the time spent in transitions, so that we are extending the time that children are engaged and learning. We want to make sure that materials are hands-on and are interesting and engaging. And so as children are exploring wood, looking for bugs, you can see on the shelf they have different containers with bugs in them. So this is a really interactive science area. And that's another thing to really think about in terms of your classroom environment, is that the science area tends to be one of the neglected areas of a preschool classroom. I've been in preschool classrooms where it's like a book and a dead bug, right? That's off in the corner, it's dusty, nobody's going over there. of really thinking about how do you bring the science area to life? How do you have hands-on and interesting materials that children really want to engage in? This, I think, is a really cool activity. So, you know how we do marble painting? Well, this is taking it to the next level. So we have the plastic pool. The bottom of the pool has a piece of paper that's cut out, right? And so then they put paint in there, they put a large rubber ball, and the children are all holding the pool and moving it around, and doing that painting, and what they pull out ends up being a globe. So really being creative around the kinds of materials and experiences that you're offering for children. Okay, so again, we have some materials for you to look at. I put them all in one area to reflect upon. So we have the handout that provides some information about what reflection you might want to do. So creating a map of your environment. Oh, where did that go? Aha. And thinking about what challenging behaviors are you seeing, any patterns of behaviors, to really think about whether your environment is supporting children and knowing what to do and how children are using the different interest centers, especially as we're preparing and thinking about a new school year. How are you teaching children the expectations and setting up those environments with visual prompts so that they know what to do? The second is to look at how interest centers are being used, and really looking at what are the centers that are used frequently, what are the centers that aren't getting a lot of use, to really reflect on and evaluate whether or not they're set up in a way that is engaging and interesting. And this is something that, as I've been thinking about my classroom observations, that this is one of the pieces of data that I would like to be gathering for you next year. You know, we do the formal assessments with Eckers in class, but also, you know, I'm often in the classroom doing informal observations and assessments. And some of the things that I want to be looking at is your use of curriculum. So what's in the lesson plan? Am I seeing that happening in the classroom? Am I seeing creative curriculum being implemented with fidelity? Looking at how your different interest centers are being utilized, thinking about, you know, again, this option 2, are the spaces set up in ways that are engaging and interesting, and are you seeing children really using them? Working with you and with Miss Angel in terms of children that you're struggling with challenging behaviors, and maybe doing some time event samples of where really documenting for you when challenging behaviors happen, what happened prior to the behavior, what the behavior looked like, and what happened after, to help you to really think about what are ways to prevent the behavior from happening. But also, you know, we can look at and think about where in the environment challenging behaviors is happening. You know, sometimes I've seen as play in the interest centers progresses, and as the room gets a little bit messier, we see some of those challenging behaviors occurring and then escalating. And so those are all things to think about in terms of some of the role of the environment. And then the third option is to actually draw out your environment and think about your space and talk with each other and giving feedback about space. So then the other handouts are to help you with those processes. So this is these are some questions to think about in terms of reflecting on your space. This is the graph paper if you want to draw out your space. And then this is a format that you can use to track children's engagement in the different interest centers and the amount of time that they're spending in the different interest centers. Right. So those materials are all here for you to reflect upon your environment, and might be something that you want to do as you are getting ready for next year. I also really encourage you to think about how you might share some of this information with families and help families to really reflect upon the home environment, and how they might use the environment to support positive behaviors and children's engagement in play, and things that they want them to be doing while they're home together, rather than things you don't want the children to be doing. Okay. And our parting message is: the child's mode of being in the world is such that the world becomes an invitation. It is things in the beckoning world that invite the child, that awaken his curiosity, that invoke him to make sense of that multitude of experiences lying beyond, in short, to become, through his play, both an actor and a meaning maker. So we really want to think about, how does your environment invite, beckon, and awaken curiosity and engage learning for every. So thank you very much for spending this time. If you have questions, please, you can, you know how to reach out to me. Here's my contact information, but you can also post comments on the Google Classroom, and pose questions to each other. So take care, and I will talk to you all soon.